It was one of those perfect Saturday mornings when everything just felt peaceful. The kind of morning that makes you want to slow down, breathe, and enjoy the world around you. The air was warm but not too hot, and a soft breeze carried the faint smell of cut grass through the neighborhood. In a quiet suburban area not far from Washington, D.C., most families were inside, catching up on chores or sleeping in. But in one house at the end of the cul-de-sac, someone had decided to enjoy the sunshine in the best way possible. Linda had been looking forward to this weekend all week. Her schedule was always packed, her phone always buzzing, and her days filled with long meetings and endless reports. For once, she had a free Saturday. No calls, no urgent emails, no deadlines, just peace. So she decided to do something simple. Sit by her pool, soak up the sun, and let her mind rest. Her backyard was her little escape, surrounded by tall hedges that gave her privacy, a few flowering plants by the fence, and the gentle sound of water rippling in the pool. She poured herself a glass of iced tea, grabbed a wide-brimmed hat, and settled onto her lounge chair. She closed her eyes and smiled as the sun warmed her skin. It felt like a moment of calm she truly deserved. But peace doesn't last long when you have a neighbor like Karen. Karen lived in the house right next door. She was one of those people who always seemed to be watching, always paying attention to what everyone else was doing. Some called it curiosity. Others called it something less kind. Either way, she knew everyone's routine, who left for work early, who got home late, and who didn't mow their lawn often enough. That morning, Karen was standing by her kitchen window, coffee cup in hand, when she noticed something unusual. Through the slats of her blinds, she saw someone sitting by the pool next door. The house had been quiet for a few days, and Karen, being who she was, had convinced herself that maybe the owner was out of town. So when she spotted a woman lounging in a swimsuit, her mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. Her eyes narrowed. "Who is that?" she muttered under her breath. She watched for a while, trying to figure it out. The woman looked calm. Too calm for someone breaking into someone else's property, Karen thought. But that didn't stop her imagination from running wild. Within minutes, Karen had convinced herself that this was serious. What if this woman broke in? She whispered, staring through the blinds. What if she's one of those squatters you hear about on the news? She couldn't just ignore it. Karen set her coffee cup down and picked up her phone. "Hello, yes," she said when the dispatcher answered. "I'd like to report a trespasser. There's a strange woman using my neighbor's pool, and I think she doesn't belong there." Her voice was confident, almost proud that she was doing the right thing. She gave the address and waited for reassurance. The dispatcher took the details calmly and said officers would be sent to check it out. Karen hung up, feeling oddly satisfied. She peeked out the window again, still watching. "We'll see what you're really up to," she whispered. Meanwhile, Linda had no idea what was going on next door. She was lying back with her sunglasses on, music playing softly from her phone. Her mind drifted. She thought about her last few months. The stress, the long hours, the meetings that never seemed to end. Being a leader in a high-pressure job meant she was always on, always careful about what she said and did. This backyard, this small space, was one of the few places she could truly switch off and just be herself. She wasn't the type who cared about appearances. She wasn't even wearing makeup, just sunscreen. To her, this was bliss and a break from everything. But a few houses away, 2 police cars were already making their way down the quiet street. The sound of tires crunching against the gravel caught Karen's attention first. Her heart gave a little flutter of satisfaction. She quickly pulled her curtain aside again, eager to see what would happen. The patrol cars stopped near the curb and 2 officers stepped out. They exchanged a few quiet words before one of them nodded toward the backyard. Karen's eyes lit up as she watched them approach. Inside her yard, Linda finally opened her eyes. The sound of footsteps startled her. She looked up and saw 2 uniformed officers standing near the gate. For a split second, her brain froze. This was her home, her private space, and yet there were police officers right there looking serious. "Good afternoon, ma'am," one of them said politely but cautiously. "We received a report about a possible trespassing situation." Linda blinked, unsure she heard that right. "Trespassing?" she repeated. "Yes," the officer said, keeping his tone professional. "A neighbor called to report that someone might be on this property without permission." For a moment, Linda just stared. Then she let out a quiet laugh. though it wasn't meant to be rude. It was the kind of laugh that comes from pure disbelief. "I think there's been a mistake," she said calmly. "This is my home." The officers looked at each other. "Would you mind showing some identification just to confirm?" one asked. "Of course," she said. "Would you like to come inside?" As Linda led them toward the house, she noticed the familiar face of her neighbor peeking out through the curtains. The same neighbor who had always been a little too interested in everyone else's business. Suddenly, it made sense. Linda sighed softly, trying to stay patient. The officers followed her through the sliding glass door into the kitchen. The house was tidy, filled with the warm, neutral tones of someone who didn't have much time to decorate but liked things clean and in order. A few framed photos hung on the wall, mostly landscapes, a couple of family pictures, and one with her standing next to what looked like a large building in D.C. She opened a drawer, pulled out her wallet, and handed them her driver's license. The officers glanced at it, then at her, and one of them nodded. "Thank you, ma'am. We appreciate your cooperation," he said. "No problem," she replied with a polite smile. "I understand you're just doing your job." Out of habit, one of the officers radioed the name in for verification. It was a standard procedure, just to make sure everything matched. As they waited, Linda noticed Karen still watching from her window. She felt a mix of amusement and annoyance. She didn't like drawing attention, especially not in her own neighborhood. She worked hard to keep her personal life quiet, and the last thing she needed was gossip. When the officer's radio finally crackled with a response, his expression changed slightly. He looked surprised. His partner glanced at him, eyebrows raised. Whatever came through that radio clearly wasn't what they expected. Linda noticed their sudden change in demeanor. She didn't say anything, just waited calmly, arms crossed loosely. She'd been through far more intense moments than this. Meetings with foreign officials, press conferences, high-stakes decisions that affected national security. A nosy neighbor was hardly intimidating. After a pause, the officer cleared his throat. "Thank you again, ma'am," he said, now with a noticeably respectful tone. "We're sorry for the misunderstanding." "You're all set," Linda nodded. "No harm done. I appreciate you checking in." As the officers walked back toward the gate, Karen was already outside pretending to water her plants, trying to look innocent. The officers gave her a brief, polite nod before getting back into their patrol cars. Linda, meanwhile, walked back to her lounge chair, picked up her glass of iced tea, and sat down again. She took a slow sip, letting the chill of the drink contrast with the warmth of the sun. She didn't look over at Karen, though she could feel the woman's eyes on her. A small smile appeared on her face. Not because she was angry, but because the whole thing was almost absurd. She couldn't believe her relaxing day had turned into a police visit, all because her neighbor couldn't mind her own business. As she closed her eyes again, she couldn't help but think, if only she knew who I really am. Linda sat quietly by the pool, pretending to relax again, but her mind kept replaying what just happened. She couldn't help but smile at the irony of it all. She had handled far more serious incidents in her career. Yet somehow, being accused of trespassing at her own house by her nosy neighbor felt like something out of a comedy show. She picked up her phone and checked the time. It wasn't even noon. "What a morning," she murmured under her breath. She could still picture the startled faces of the officers when they realized who she was. Their voices had changed completely from cautious to polite, almost apologetic. Across the fence, Karen was still hovering around her backyard, pretending to pull weeds, but clearly dying to know what had just happened. Every few seconds, her eyes darted toward Linda's yard. She wanted confirmation that her call had been justified, that she hadn't just embarrassed herself in front of the entire neighborhood. Linda ignored her. She had no interest in confrontation, at least not yet. All she wanted was to enjoy the rest of her day. But she couldn't deny that curiosity about how far this misunderstanding had gone was growing inside her. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. It was a message from one of her colleagues, someone from her office. It simply said, "Everything okay, boss? Heard something funny on the local channel." Linda frowned, realizing that even routine police checks could end up being logged somewhere. Small-town systems sometimes flagged her name automatically, and people in her line of work tended to notice. She replied quickly, "All good. Just a neighborhood mix-up." Then she set her phone down and sighed. The sound of a door opening broke the calm. Linda looked up to see Karen walking toward the shared fence. She held a forced smile, the kind that comes when someone's trying to act casual but can't quite pull it off. "Hi there," Karen called out, voice too cheerful. Linda lifted her sunglasses. "Hello. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay," Karen said, resting her arms on the fence. "I saw the police here earlier and, well, you can never be too careful these days, you know?" Linda stayed quiet for a second, studying her neighbor. She could see the mix of curiosity and guilt on her face. "Yes," she said finally, her tone calm but firm. "Everything's fine. There was just some confusion." "Oh, good, good," Karen said quickly, a nervous laugh escaping her. "I thought maybe someone had broken into the house or something. It's just, I wasn't sure if the property was empty or not." Linda tilted her head slightly. "I've lived here for 2 years," she said evenly. "We've spoken before, haven't we?" Karen's cheeks turned a little pink. "Oh, yes, of course. I remember now," she said, trying to laugh it off. "I guess I just didn't recognize you from here. You looked so relaxed I thought maybe you were someone else." "That's understandable," Linda said politely, though the corners of her mouth twitched in amusement. "I suppose I should be flattered you were keeping an eye out." Karen forced another smile. "Well, you know me. I just like to make sure everything's in order around here." "I've noticed," Linda replied softly. The tone wasn't harsh, but it was enough to make Karen uncomfortable. She stammered something about the weather and then quickly retreated toward her back door. Once she was gone, Linda let out a quiet breath. She didn't want to be unkind. Karen wasn't a bad person, just one of those people who needed to feel involved in everything. Maybe she meant well, even if she had gone about it the wrong way. Still, the whole thing reminded Linda of why she valued her privacy so much. After a while, she decided to head inside. She refilled her drink and glanced around her kitchen. It was peaceful again, but she could still sense the lingering awkwardness in the air. Neighborhoods like this thrived on stories, and she had just become the newest topic of conversation. Sure enough, within an hour, 2 more neighbors happened to walk their dogs past her house. They slowed down near the driveway, pretending to check their phones while stealing quick glances toward her yard. She almost laughed. The rumor mill was already in motion. She could practically hear the whispered conversations that would follow. "Did you hear about the woman next door? The police came this morning. Something about trespassing." But Linda wasn't the type to get rattled easily. She'd faced public scrutiny before, real scrutiny. This was nothing. If anything, it was a reminder that even people who lived quiet, ordinary lives could be quick to assume the worst. Later that afternoon, she decided to go for a walk. She changed into casual clothes and put on a baseball cap, hoping to blend in. As she walked down the street, she passed a few familiar faces. Neighbors who gave her polite smiles but also that subtle look of curiosity. One older gentleman waved. "Everything all right, Miss Pearson?" "Yes, thank you," she said with a kind smile. "Just a small misunderstanding earlier." He nodded knowingly. "Ah, that Karen again?" Linda chuckled softly. "You could say that," he shook his head. "She means well, but she's got too much time on her hands." "Don't let her bother you." "I won't," Linda said, meaning it. As she walked further, she thought about how quickly assumptions could spiral. A single phone call, a few wrong guesses, and suddenly your quiet morning turns into an official visit. She wasn't angry, but she couldn't help thinking about how many times people made judgments like that, and how often it caused real harm. By the time she got home, the sun was starting to dip low in the sky. The light shimmered over the pool and the air had cooled just enough to be comfortable again. She changed back into her swimwear and decided to end the day the way it had started, in peace. But peace didn't come easily when you had a neighbor like Karen. From across the fence, she heard faint voices. Karen was talking on the phone, her voice carrying farther than she probably realized. Linda couldn't catch every word, but she heard enough to understand what was being said. "Yes, the police came. Can you believe it? I thought the house was empty. Well, how was I supposed to know she lives there? She looked so calm, like she owned the place." Linda smiled faintly to herself. "Like I owned the place," she repeated under her breath, amused by the irony. She took another sip of iced tea and looked up at the fading light. There was something oddly comforting about the quiet now, even if it had come after an unnecessary bit of chaos. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a short call from one of her colleagues. she answered, keeping her tone light. You really got the local police visiting you? Her coworker teased. Apparently so, Linda said with a laugh. A concerned citizen thought I was trespassing in my own home. Well, you always say to stay alert, he joked. I guess I should start taking my own advice, she replied, smiling. After hanging up, she thought about how this simple misunderstanding could serve as a small life lesson, not just for her, but maybe for everyone involved. People judge too quickly. They see a moment out of context and build a whole story around it. She couldn't fault Karen for being cautious, but maybe she could help her and others see things differently next time. As the evening came, the street grew quieter. The last bits of sunlight danced across the water. Linda wrapped a towel around herself and stood by the pool's edge for a moment, looking out over her peaceful little world. It was funny how life worked. One moment you're invisible to your neighbors and the next you're the most talked about person on the block. But what they didn't know, what Karen certainly didn't know, was who she really was. To them, she was just another woman living in a nice house with a pool. They had no idea that the same person they'd just reported to the police was someone who led investigations, managed agents, and carried responsibilities that stretched far beyond their street. Linda thought about that and chuckled softly. There was something poetic about it, the idea that power and status meant nothing in moments like these. At home, she was just another neighbor, and maybe that was a good thing. As she turned off the backyard lights and went inside, her phone buzzed again, this time a message from the local police department. A quick, polite note apologizing for the inconvenience earlier that day. She appreciated their professionalism. She typed a brief reply, "No worries. You handled it well." She looked out the window one last time before going to bed. Karen's house was dark, except for a single lamp near the window, the same window she'd been peeking through that morning. Linda smiled to herself. I guess I gave her enough excitement for one day, she whispered. And with that, she switched off her light and went to bed, ready to start a new day. Though part of her knew the neighborhood would be buzzing with gossip for weeks to come. In a way, that was fine. Let them talk. Sometimes stories like this had a way of reminding people to think twice before jumping to conclusions. Because while Karen had called the police thinking she was protecting the neighborhood, she had no idea that the woman by the pool wasn't a stranger at all, but the one person in the whole area most qualified to protect them if anything truly went wrong. And tomorrow, Linda knew, would bring a new chapter, one where truth would quietly make its way through whispers and surprise everyone who thought they already knew the story. The morning after the police visit, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. It wasn't the normal kind of weekend silence. It was that awkward stillness that settles in when everyone knows something happened. But nobody wants to be the first to mention it. Linda woke up early, as she always did. Years of habit had trained her body to start the day before the sun fully rose. She made coffee, stood by the kitchen window, and watched as the world outside slowly came to life. It looked peaceful, as if nothing unusual had ever happened here. Birds fluttered between trees. A few cars passed by and a jogger waved politely as he went by the front gate. But behind that normal view, Linda could sense the quiet buzz of gossip moving through the neighborhood. By mid-morning, she was proven right. As she took her trash to the curb, one of the neighbors from across the street, a friendly older woman named Rita, called out to her with a smile that was half genuine, half curious. "Morning. Everything okay, dear? Heard there was a bit of excitement yesterday." Linda smiled softly. "Everything's fine, thank you. Just a misunderstanding." Rita nodded, pretending to be satisfied, but Linda could see the curiosity burning in her eyes. "Oh, I'm glad to hear that," she said sweetly. "You know how people talk." Karen seemed worried. "I'm sure she was," Linda said kindly, though there was a tiny sparkle of humor in her eyes. As she walked back toward her house, Linda noticed Karen's curtains move ever so slightly. The woman was watching again, pretending not to. Linda could almost imagine what was going through her neighbor's mind. She probably wanted to come over and ask what had really happened, but embarrassment was holding her back. Inside, Linda poured another cup of coffee and sat at her kitchen table. She opened her laptop and began reviewing a few files she hadn't finished the week before. Her work was demanding, but she had learned how to manage it quietly. Her position required discretion, patience, and a calm demeanor. People around her often said she had the kind of composure that made others nervous without her ever raising her voice. It was one of the reasons she'd been promoted so many times. Around noon, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a familiar number, the local police department. Linda sighed softly, not out of frustration, but because she knew this was likely a follow-up from the day before. She answered. "Good afternoon, this is Linda," she said in her usual calm tone. "Good afternoon, ma'am. This is Officer Daniels from the precinct. I just wanted to call and apologize again for the situation yesterday. We didn't realize who you were until later." "There's no need to apologize," Linda said. "You were doing your job." "Yes, ma'am," he replied quickly. "Still, when we heard back from our supervisor and saw your file, well, let's just say we were surprised. Not every day we respond to a call involving the assistant director of the FBI." Linda chuckled quietly. "I imagine not," he hesitated. "Ma'am, if you don't mind my saying so, your neighbor looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole when she realized what had happened. She followed us all the way to the car asking questions, but we couldn't exactly tell her much." "That's all right," Linda said. "I think she's learned her lesson." Officer Daniels laughed softly. "You handled it better than most would have. Anyway, just wanted to check in. Have a good day, ma'am." "You too, officer," she said before hanging up. When she put her phone down, she couldn't help but smile. She didn't like drawing attention, but there was a small satisfaction in knowing that the truth was slowly making its way through the neighborhood. Later that afternoon, she decided to step outside to do some gardening. She loved tending to her plants, and it helped her clear her mind. While she worked, she could hear faint sounds from next door. The creak of a gate, the soft shuffle of footsteps. She didn't look up right away, but she could tell someone was lingering nearby. After a moment, she heard a hesitant voice. "Hi, do you have a second?" Linda turned around slowly. Karen was standing by the fence looking unusually nervous. She was holding a small plate covered with foil, her hands fidgeting as she spoke. "Sure," Linda said kindly, brushing some soil off her gloves. "What can I do for you?" Karen let out an awkward laugh. "Well, I wanted to apologize. About yesterday. I really thought someone was breaking in and I didn't want anything bad to happen. I didn't realize it was you." Linda studied her for a moment. Karen's eyes were full of genuine regret, her posture smaller than usual. The confidence she'd shown yesterday was gone. "It's all right," Linda said softly. "I understand you were trying to help." Karen looked relieved. "Thank you. I felt terrible after the officers told me everything was fine. I swear I was just trying to be careful." She lifted the plate in her hands awkwardly. "I made some cookies. It's not much, but I thought maybe it could make up for, you know?" Linda smiled warmly. "That's very kind of you." "Thank you." Karen passed the plate over the fence, and for the first time Linda saw a hint of real sincerity in her neighbor. It wasn't the gossiping, judgmental person from before, just someone who'd acted too quickly and wanted to make things right. "I'm really embarrassed," Karen admitted. "When I saw the police cars pull up, I was sure I'd done the right thing. But then, well, when they came out looking all polite and nervous, I knew I'd messed up. It happens," Linda said gently. "We all make assumptions sometimes." Karen hesitated, then asked quietly, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." The officers kept calling you ma'am in a way that sounded different, like respectful. And they said something about DC. I know it's not my business, but do you work with the government or something?" Linda paused for a brief second. She wasn't the type to advertise her job, but she also saw no harm in honesty, especially now. "I do, yes," she said simply. "I work in law enforcement." Karen's eyes widened a little. "Oh, wow, like a police officer?" "Something like that," Linda replied with a small smile. Karen nodded slowly, her mind clearly spinning with possibilities. "No wonder they changed their tone so fast," she said under her breath. Then quickly, "I mean, they were so professional." "I didn't mean that in a bad way," Linda laughed softly. "It's all right. I know what you meant." There was a brief silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time since they'd become neighbors, there was something genuine in their interaction. "Well," Karen said finally, "if you ever need anything or if you ever want someone to water your plants while you're away, just let me know. I owe you one." "I'll keep that in mind," Linda said warmly. As Karen walked back to her house, Linda stood there for a moment, holding the plate of cookies and smiling to herself. It was funny how quickly things could change. Yesterday, this woman had seen her as a stranger, maybe even a threat. Today, she was baking for her. Later that evening, Linda had a few friends from work over for a small get-together. They sat on her patio, laughing, sharing stories, and catching up. One of her colleagues, a tall man named Victor, leaned back in his chair and said, "So, I heard about your little neighborhood adventure." Linda rolled her eyes with a grin. "It's already made it to the office, hasn't it?" "Oh, you know how word spreads," he said. "Everyone's been joking that you managed to get yourself investigated by your own local police." "I wasn't investigated," Linda said with mock offense. "I was sunbathing." Sure, he teased. "Next time maybe you should wear your badge around your neck. Might save some time." They all laughed, and Linda shook her head. "If I start doing that, I'll never get a moment of peace." The group fell into easy conversation. As the sun set, warm light reflected off the pool, creating a calm glow that made the whole backyard feel like a little oasis. For Linda, it was a reminder that even when life threw her strange moments, there was always balance waiting at the end. After her friends left, she cleaned up and sat quietly for a while. The air was cool and the sky was turning deep blue. She thought about how different people saw the world, how Karen's fear had turned a simple scene into a crisis. But she also saw how easily things could be fixed with a little understanding. The next morning, Linda found a small note in her mailbox. It was from Karen. The handwriting was neat but shaky. It read, "Thank you for being kind to me. I was wrong to assume the worst. You've taught me to think before I act. I hope we can be better neighbors from now on." Linda smiled as she folded the note and tucked it into her pocket. She appreciated the gesture. It wasn't often that people admitted their mistakes so openly. A few weeks later, life returned to normal. The gossip had faded. The police visit became just another neighborhood story that people half remembered. And Linda continued her routine, calm, steady, and content. But sometimes when she walked by the fence, Karen would wave and they'd share a friendly smile. Neither of them brought up that day again, but they both knew it had changed something between them. It wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about how quick people can be to judge, and how forgiveness, even in small, quiet moments, can fix what words alone can't. And though Karen never fully found out the truth about Linda's position, she learned enough to respect her, not just as a neighbor, but as someone who carried herself with grace even when wrongly accused. For Linda, that was enough. Because sometimes the best way to teach someone isn't through lectures or authority. It's through calmness, patience, and the quiet power of example. And so, life in that quiet cul-de-sac went on, peaceful again, but forever carrying the memory of the day the neighbor called the police on the woman next door, never realizing she was the one person who protected people like her every single day. A few weeks passed since the morning that turned the neighborhood upside down. The story had settled into silence, the way all gossip eventually does when nothing new happens to feed it. The days grew warmer, the trees thicker with leaves, and the hum of summer began to take over the quiet cul-de-sac once again. Linda had gone back to her usual routine. Her work kept her busy, though she managed to find small moments of calm in between. She liked the predictability of early mornings, the comfort of coffee on the porch, and the quiet hours by her pool in the evenings. Life felt balanced again, peaceful, simple, and private. Karen, meanwhile, had changed too, though in small and subtle ways. She still peeked out her window now and then, still noticed the details of everyone's lives, who came and went, who trimmed their hedges, who didn't. But she had become softer in her judgments. Ever since the incident, she carried a quiet sense of humility, like someone who'd seen themselves too clearly for the first time. And although she and Linda didn't talk often, there was a friendliness between them now, the kind that comes from shared experience, even an awkward one. One Friday morning, as Linda was leaving for work, she noticed Karen standing by her mailbox, struggling with a stack of envelopes. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "Need a hand?" she asked. Karen looked up, startled, then smiled gratefully. "Oh, thank you. I think I tried to carry too much at once." Linda helped her steady the pile. "Happens to the best of us," Karen laughed softly. "You'd think I'd have learned by now." As Linda handed the letters back, Karen looked at her with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. You always seem so calm, she said suddenly, even when everything's going wrong. I don't know how you do it, Linda smiled. Years of practice, Karen nodded, thoughtful. I guess that's part of your job, huh? Staying calm. Linda didn't answer right away. It helps, she said eventually, keeping her tone light. Something about her voice, and steady, almost formal, made Karen pause. She had been wondering for weeks what Linda really did for a living. She knew it was something important, something serious, but no one in the neighborhood seemed to know exactly what. Before she could ask, Linda's phone buzzed in her bag. She glanced at the screen and a slight frown crossed her face. Excuse me just a second, she said politely. Karen nodded and began sorting through her mail again, pretending not to listen. But the moment Linda answered, her voice changed slightly. Lower, professional, focused. Yes, this is Pearson, Linda said quietly. I saw the report. Keep the team on standby until I arrive. No action until I confirm. Her words were calm, but her tone carried authority. Not the kind that comes from arrogance, but the kind that comes from leadership. Even in that brief moment, Karen could tell this wasn't a normal office job. When Linda hung up, she smiled apologetically. Sorry about that. Work doesn't always wait for business hours. No, I understand, Karen said, still curious but trying not to show it. That sounded important. Linda shrugged gently. It usually is. As she walked back toward her car, Karen watched her go, her mind buzzing. That call didn't sound like a typical workplace conversation. It was precise, commanding, almost official. Later that afternoon, as Karen chatted with another neighbor while watering her garden, the topic came up again. Do you know what Linda does for work? She asked casually. The neighbor shrugged. I've heard she's in government. Something high up, maybe with law enforcement. I'm not sure. Karen nodded slowly. That confirmed what she already suspected. But she didn't want to pry further. Not after everything that had happened. Still, the thought lingered in her mind. Especially later that week when she saw 2 black SUVs parked briefly in front of Linda's house. The men who stepped out were dressed neatly with quiet professional movements. They spoke briefly with Linda at her door, then left just as quickly as they came. To anyone else, it might have looked like a visit from friends. But Karen noticed the details, the way they carried themselves, the earpieces, the way one of them glanced around before leaving. That evening, curiosity finally got the best of her. She baked a small batch of muffins, her go-to excuse for checking in, and walked over to Linda's house. She knocked lightly on the front door. Linda opened it a moment later, still in her work clothes, looking pleasantly surprised. Karen, hi, everything all right? Oh yes, Karen said quickly. I just wanted to drop these off. I made too many. That's kind of you, Linda said warmly, accepting the plate. Come in for a minute. Karen hesitated. Are you sure? I don't want to interrupt. Not at all, Linda said, stepping aside. I was just catching up on some files. Karen stepped in, glancing around politely. The house was neat and simple, but on the coffee table sat a few folders marked with small, discreet labels. One bore a seal that looked official, though she couldn't make out the words. Linda noticed her glance and smiled. Just work stuff, she said casually. Karen nodded, though her mind was spinning. You must be very busy. It comes with the territory, Linda said, setting the muffins on the counter. Would you like some tea? Karen nodded, grateful for the offer. As Linda prepared it, they made small talk. The weather, the noise from the nearby construction, the neighborhood's new families. Everything felt easy and normal. But then, just as Linda poured the tea, her phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID flashed with the letters HQ. Karen tried not to look, but her eyes caught it anyway. Linda glanced at the screen, sighed quietly, and answered. Yes, this is Pearson. I'm reviewing the file now. No, tell them to hold briefing until I arrive. Yes, 0800 sharp. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying that unmistakable tone of command again. When she hung up, she smiled apologetically. Sorry, that was work again. Karen nodded, still a little stunned. You must have a really important job. Linda gave a small, knowing smile. I suppose some people would say that. Karen hesitated, then said softly, You don't have to tell me if it's private, but I keep hearing people say you work for the government. Is that true? Linda looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Yes, I do. Something to do with law enforcement? You could say that, Linda said with a small smile. I work with the Bureau. The Bureau? Karen repeated, confused for a moment. Then realization dawned. Wait, do you mean the FBI? Linda's expression didn't change much, but her eyes softened with amusement. That's right. Karen's mouth fell open slightly. You're with the FBI? Yes, Linda said calmly. I'm the assistant director for the Washington field office. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of a clock. Karen blinked, speechless. Everything from that morning weeks ago came rushing back. The phone call, the officers, their sudden change in tone. It all made sense now. Oh my goodness, she whispered finally. I called the police on you. Linda laughed quietly. Yes, you did. Karen covered her face with her hands, mortified. I feel so stupid. Don't, Linda said gently. You didn't know. You were trying to do the right thing. Karen peeked through her fingers, still blushing. I can't believe this. I thought you were trespassing in your own yard. I suppose that's one way to make a first impression, Linda said, smiling. Karen groaned softly. No wonder the officers looked so nervous. They must have wanted to disappear once they realized who you were. They handled it professionally, Linda said kindly, and honestly, it's not something I'll hold against you. I've seen far worse misunderstandings. Karen exhaled slowly, still trying to process everything. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Linda said. Just maybe next time ask before you assume. Karen nodded quickly. I definitely will. I've learned my lesson. They both laughed softly, the tension fading into something almost friendly. After a while, Linda changed the topic to lighter things where gardening tips, local shops, the upcoming neighborhood barbecue. The conversation flowed easily again, but Karen couldn't help glancing at her neighbor with new eyes. The calm, quiet woman who tended her flowers and read on her porch was, in fact, one of the most senior law enforcement officials in the region. When she left that evening, Karen walked home slowly, the warm night air buzzing with crickets. She couldn't stop smiling, partly from embarrassment, partly from awe. She had spent years thinking she knew everyone's story, and yet the person living right next door had been someone far more remarkable than she ever imagined. That night, as she sat on her porch sipping iced tea, she looked over at Linda's house. The lights were on, and faintly through the window she could see her neighbor at her desk still working. Karen felt a quiet respect, not the kind built on status or power, but the kind that comes from seeing a person's character. In her mind, she replayed Linda's calm smile, her patience, the way she handled everything with grace instead of anger. It was humbling. From that day on, Karen stopped gossiping as much. She stopped assuming she knew people's stories. Sometimes, when she saw a new face in the neighborhood, she'd smile and remind herself that everyone had a life far more complicated than what could be seen from a window. And for Linda, nothing really changed. She still enjoyed her quiet mornings, her coffee, her pool. But every now and then, when she caught a glimpse of Karen waving from her porch, she'd smile back, because sometimes even misunderstandings can lead to better understanding. The next few weeks moved quietly through the neighborhood. The sun felt softer, the days a little slower. It was the kind of summer rhythm that made everything feel calm again. People mowed their lawns, children rode bikes down the street, and the sound of sprinklers filled the air every evening. Life had settled back into its ordinary routine, but for Linda and Karen, something had changed, something quiet but real. There was a new understanding between them, the kind that didn't need many words. They had shared an awkward, unforgettable moment, and somehow it had turned into something almost like friendship. Linda often smiled when she saw Karen tending to her rose bushes. She had grown to appreciate the small gestures, the way Karen now waved every morning instead of pretending not to notice her, or how she left little notes by the mailbox when she baked too many cookies. They weren't close friends, not yet, but there was warmth there, and for Karen every day brought a little reminder of how one mistake had changed her. She no longer looked at people through the narrow lens of suspicion. Instead, she looked for understanding first. She had been the kind of person who thought she knew everyone's story just by watching from her window, who they were, what they did, what kind of lives they lived. But now she realized how wrong that was. The quiet woman next door hadn't been a stranger trespassing by the pool. She had been a respected leader, someone carrying more responsibility than most could imagine. Sometimes Karen thought about that day, about the way her heart had raced when the police cars pulled up and how everything flipped in a single moment. The embarrassment had faded, replaced by gratitude. Gratitude that she had learned something valuable in such a humbling way. One afternoon, about a month after the whole incident, Karen saw Linda coming home early from work. She was dressed more casually than usual, wearing a light shirt and jeans instead of her usual office clothes. She carried a grocery bag in one hand and her keys in the other. Karen called out from across the yard, "Hi there, you're home early today," Linda smiled. "Just finished a meeting sooner than expected. Thought I'd take the rest of the day off." "Well, good for you," Karen said. "You deserve it. You work too much." "I hear that a lot," Linda said with a small laugh. Karen hesitated for a moment, then said, "I'm having some lemonade on the porch. You're welcome to join if you'd like." Linda looked pleasantly surprised. "That sounds nice. Give me a minute to put these inside." A few minutes later, she joined Karen on the porch. The late afternoon sun stretched long and golden over the lawns. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and warm pavement. Karen poured 2 glasses of lemonade and handed one to her. "It's fresh. I didn't make it too sweet." "Perfect," Linda said, taking a sip. "You make good lemonade." They sat quietly for a while, watching a couple of kids ride by on their scooters. There was an easy comfort in the silence, like two people who didn't need to fill every gap with words. After a few minutes, Karen said softly, "You know, I still can't believe how wrong I was about you." Linda looked at her gently. "You weren't wrong to care. You just acted before you knew the facts, I guess," Karen said with a sigh. "It's funny, though. I thought I was helping, but I ended up making a fool of myself." Linda smiled. "We've all done that in one way or another. The important thing is that you cared enough to act. The world could use more of that. Maybe just with a little more patience next time." Karen laughed, shaking her head. "I'll try to remember that." Linda leaned back in her chair. "You know, that day actually reminded me of something too." "Oh?" "Yes, it reminded me that people don't always mean harm even when they make mistakes. In my job, I see a lot of conflict. But sometimes it's just fear or confusion or people trying to do what they think is right." Karen looked at her thoughtfully. "That's a nice way to see it." Linda nodded. "It's true. If we spent more time understanding instead of assuming, half the world's problems would disappear." Karen smiled at that. "You really do sound like someone who works for the government." Linda laughed softly. "Guilty as charged." They both chuckled, and the sound felt easy and natural. The tension that had once existed between them was long gone. As the sun dipped lower, Karen turned serious again. "Do people at your job know about what happened here?" "The mix-up?" Linda grinned. "A few of them heard, yes. It became a bit of an inside joke at the office. I'm never going to live down the FBI agent who got a trespassing call at her own house." Karen groaned, covering her face. "Oh no, they really joke about it?" "In a kind way," Linda said. "I laughed about it too. Honestly, it was a nice reminder that even I can't control everything. Sometimes life throws a little comedy into the mix." Karen laughed, relaxing again. "I'm glad you took it so well." "I don't think I could have. Maybe not at first," Linda said. "But you'd be surprised how forgiving you can become when you've seen enough of the world. You realize most things aren't worth holding on to." Karen nodded slowly, taking another sip of lemonade. "You're right. I used to get so worked up about small things. Noisy kids, dogs barking, cars parked too close to my mailbox. I thought being in control made me safe, but it just made me tired." Linda glanced at her kindly. "That's something a lot of people never figure out." "You did?" Karen smiled. "Well, it took calling the police on my neighbor for it to happen, but I guess it's never too late to learn." Linda laughed again, shaking her head. "At least it makes for a great story." As evening approached, the air cooled a little. Fireflies began to blink near the hedges, and a soft orange light glowed in the windows of the nearby houses. The quiet felt almost comforting. After a while, Karen said, "You know, when you first moved here, I didn't think we'd ever talk like this." Linda looked at her with a small smile. "Why not?" "I guess I thought you were too private. You always seemed busy, important, like someone who didn't have time for small talk." Linda nodded. "That's fair. I probably did come across that way. My work can be demanding and I tend to value my quiet time." Karen looked at her hands, thoughtful. I used to think people who kept to themselves were unfriendly. Now I see that sometimes they just need peace. Linda smiled. Exactly. There was another short silence filled with the sound of crickets and distant laughter from a house down the street. Finally, Karen said softly, "Thank you." Linda looked at her, curious. For what? For not getting angry with me. For being kind about the whole thing. You had every right to yell at me and you didn't. Linda shook her head gently. Anger doesn't fix much. It just makes people defensive. You already learned your lesson. There was no need to make you feel worse. Karen smiled faintly. Still, thank you, Linda nodded. You're welcome. They sat together for a long time after that, talking about little things and the weather, travel plans, old stories from their childhoods. It felt nice, simple, and human. That night, when Linda finally went home, she paused for a moment on her porch. She looked across the yard and saw Karen still sitting with her empty glass, staring up at the stars. It made her smile. The next morning, as she left for work, Linda found a small envelope by her door. Inside was a short note written in neat handwriting. Dear Linda, I'm grateful for your patience and kindness. You've taught me more than you realize. I'm lucky to have you as a neighbor. Linda read the note twice and smiled. She folded it carefully and placed it on her desk before leaving for work. Weeks turned into months. The story of the pool incident faded into a funny memory, something the neighbors occasionally joked about during block parties. But it also became something else, a quiet lesson that people carried with them. Whenever someone new moved into the neighborhood, Karen was always the first to welcome them now. She'd bring cookies, introduce herself, and say with a laugh, I used to be the nosy one around here. Don't worry, I've retired from that job. Everyone liked her. She had become warmer, friendlier, and far more patient than before. It was as though one small mistake had opened her eyes to how much better life felt when you gave people the benefit of the doubt. Linda, too, found herself smiling more often at the little things. A child's laughter, a kind word from a stranger, the sound of rain on the roof after a long day. She still worked hard, still carried the weight of her job, but she carried it differently now, lighter somehow. Sometimes during her morning coffee, she thought about how one neighbor's misunderstanding had turned into a small but meaningful friendship. It reminded her that even the most unexpected moments could bring people closer, if handled with grace. A year later, on the anniversary of that unforgettable day, Karen invited the neighbors over for a small summer gathering by her garden. Linda came, of course, bringing a bowl of fruit salad. As people laughed and talked, someone jokingly brought up the famous pool call. Karen laughed along with them. Oh, believe me, I'll never live that down, she said, shaking her head. But it turned out all right, didn't it? Linda raised her glass and smiled. It turned out better than all right, she said. Sometimes a misunderstanding can lead to something good. Everyone nodded and laughed. And the evening carried on with the easy joy of community. People who had learned, in their own ways, to be just a little kinder and a little more patient. Later that night, when the guests had gone home and the street was quiet again, Linda and Karen stood together at the end of the driveway. The air was soft and cool, and the moon hung low above the rooftops. Karen looked at her and said quietly, You know, if someone had told me 2 years ago that I'd be friends with an FBI director, I would have laughed. Linda smiled. And if someone told me I'd be friends with the neighbor who called the cops on me, I would have done the same. They both laughed, and it felt easy, genuine, the kind of laughter that comes from real understanding. As they said goodnight and went their separate ways, both women felt grateful in their own quiet way. For Linda, it was a reminder that titles and badges didn't define people. Kindness did. And for Karen, it was proof that even mistakes could lead to something good if met with forgiveness. From that night on, they waved to each other every morning without fail. Sometimes they shared coffee, sometimes just a smile, but always a moment of kindness. The story that began with suspicion had ended with friendship, and in that quiet little neighborhood, where fences once felt like walls, they had become bridges instead.